what my collaborators and I were interested in investigating is not what's the content of those stereotypes, but why is the content what it is? What explains why we have the stereotypes that we do?
Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to episode 27 of the Armchair Scholars podcast. Today on the show, we have Dr. Keelah Williams. She obtained her doctorate and Juris Doctor from Arizona State University. She is currently an evolutionary psychologist studying the intersection between law and behavior. A lot of her current research focuses on stereotype content, punishment strategies, and also legal decision-making. And in today's conversation, we discussed how she got into law and evolutionary psychology, the death penalty, stereotypes, and then lastly, friendship qualities. We jump around a little bit, but this conversation was extremely fascinating, extremely insightful. We dive deep into what lies underneath why some of these stereotypes exist in our world. And so, yeah, thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy. And without further ado, Dr. Keelah Williams.
Keelah, thank you for joining us. If you wouldn't mind getting everybody started by giving us just a brief background of yourself and how you got yourself into the multiple degrees and current work that you're doing today.
Sure. Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation. So to give a semi-brief background, I was born in Wollongong, Australia, and grew up in the very early years of my life on an island called Norfolk Island that's in between Australia and New Zealand. My father is Australian, my mother is American. And my father's educational background is that he comes from a larger Catholic family, and he dropped out of school when he was 15 because he had to start working to help support the rest of his family. He's the oldest son in the family. And my mother, on the other hand, has a master's degree in counseling. So very, very different type of background between the two of them. And it was very interesting as a child having a mother who was interested in psychology, in part because I felt sometimes like I was the subject of her experiments. I've seen home videos where my older brother would be like shutting the door on me, shutting me out of the house, and I'd be sitting there crying. And my mom just has the camera continuing rolling. She just wanted to observe to see what would happen. And she's over there pretending to be Piaget. I'm crying on the ground. So yes, very, very interesting as a child to have a mother with a psychological background. But I moved from Australia to Michigan when I was still a kid, and I went to the rest of elementary school, middle school, and high school in Michigan. And then I started college in Michigan as well. And I had read a book by Carl Zimmer called Parasite Rex, which was about parasites. And I found it the most fascinating thing that I had ever read, and it convinced me that I wanted to be a parasitologist. Did you know that parasites outnumber free living species 5-1?
Wow. I did not know that. Yeah.
They're all around you.
Oh my gosh.
So I found it so cool. And so I started as a biology major and was under the impression that I was going to go to medical school. But when I was a junior, I became a research assistant in a professor's psychology lab. The professor was Dr. Robert Himes, and he became a really close mentor for me. His research in part had to do with jury decision-making. Some of the past work that he had done before was about jury decision-making. And I found that just so interesting, the relationship between psychology and law, and got really, really interested in that. He was also doing some work looking at the physiological correlates of prejudice. So do people's heart rates increase when they view photographs of outgroup members, and looking specifically at heart rate variability and GSR, sort of the stress response that your fingertips get sweaty. And so it laid the seeds, it planted the seeds for my interest in things like stereotypes and prejudice, but also my interest in law. And when I did the senior thesis project, I made my project about jury decision making, where I was looking at verdict reversal. So the phenomenon of when jurors change their minds. And I was curious about whether, if they're faced with a unanimous disagreement with their position, if people were more likely to go from guilty to not guilty, or from not guilty to guilty, if there's any difference in the directionality that people reverse their verdicts when they're taking a minority position. And I found nothing, not a thing. The thesis did not work out at all, but I loved it. And through the work of doing the background reading and putting the study together and everything, I just became deeply fascinated by psychology and law. And so I changed from wanting to go to medical school to wanting to go to graduate school for psychology and law. And there are only a few limited number of programs in the country that will let you get a JD and a PhD at the same time. And to me, it was important to do a joint law and psychology program as compared to, for example, a legal psychology PhD, where you're only doing the PhD, but it just happens to be in the content of law. But I really wanted to go to law school in addition to doing the PhD, because when I was doing my reading for my thesis project, I would read some literature that attorneys were publishing about, how you convince the jury of your position. And then I would read psychology articles that were on a very similar or the same topic, and they would completely disagree with one another.
Wow.
And it became very obvious to me that these were essentially silos, that they, as disciplines, were not communicating very much with each other at all. And so I felt like if I wanted to be someone who could make connections between those disciplines, then I needed to understand it from both sides. I needed to be able to say, yes, I know what it is like to approach things as a lawyer. And I also know what it's like to approach things as a psychologist. And so I can speak to both camps. So that was why I targeted JD PhD programs specifically. And as I mentioned, there aren't very many of them, but one of the ones that did exist at the time that I was applying was at Arizona State University. And there's a professor there named Michael Sachs, who has done a tremendous amount of really excellent work in psychology and law. And so I applied to work with him. And then when I was admitted to the program, Michael said to me, "You also need to have an advisor in the psychology department." He could serve as my advisor in the law school, but I needed to have a specific person who would agree to be in charge of me in the psychology school as well. And so he asked me to go and look at all of the people who were in the social psychology department and to tell him who I would be most interested in working with. And the person who did research on stereotyping and prejudice was Stephen Newberg. And that had also been one of my interests, working in this research lab as an undergrad. So I thought that it could be a good fit. And it was my extreme luck, providence, I don't know what you call it, but Steve agreed to act as my supervisor. And he was taking a big risk in doing that, because I was by no means the type of student that he would have accepted if I had applied directly to work with him, because I didn't have the same background training that he was looking for, and he had never done any work in psychology and law. So it was really, I don't know if he just had a couple of mimosas and was like, to hell with it, why not? or what, but luckily he agreed to supervise me. And by the end of my PhD, I probably would say that I was working 70% with Steve and only 30% with Michael. So even though I started out applying specifically to work with Michael, by the end of it, I had gotten so interested in the work that Steve was doing that I was pulled more in that direction. Another thing to note, I guess, sorry, I'm kind of blathering on. Please interrupt me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Please keep going.
Another thing that I did while I was in graduate school was I worked at a law firm, a corporate law firm, as a summer associate. And this was at Snell and Wilmer in Phoenix. And that was just to sort of put to bed any thoughts in the back of my head of like, oh, well, what would it be like if I actually were a practicing attorney? And I just want to see a taste of what that life is really like. And so I worked for the summer for them, and it was a really wonderful experience. And it was great from a research perspective too, to actually see law in action. Gave me some more ideas for research, but it also was good closure in terms of, no, I really do want to stay in academia and focus on research instead of working as a lawyer. So then I graduated with both my JD and PhD in 2017. And I had gotten a job at Hamilton College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, in Clinton, New York, which is where I am now. And they very much have a teacher-scholar model where they value both really great teaching and also are invested in your scholarship. So to me, it was just the perfect match because I really enjoy teaching. And I also think that teaching and research go well together, that you can teach well through research and your research can be invigorated through teaching. So I really appreciated the model that Hamilton had with that. And I feel really incredibly lucky to be here. So that's, I think, up to now, how I got where I am.
I'm so fascinated to find out more about your perspective on the idea that the psychology and the law, like, we're just not engaged with one another in any way. Do you have a sample of the specific, like, what the legal statement was and what the psychology actually proves? Was it more so that, like, the law side was just choosing the one research study that may have supported their case, but it's not the, industry accepted belief, or where was the gap there?
So I think what it was coming from was that attorneys rely very heavily on intuition, especially trial attorneys who have experience with selecting jurors. And they just have gone through that process and have sort of formed impressions and opinions through anecdotes about what happened and feel very strongly that their experiences are correct. And research sometimes contradicts them or hasn't addressed it. I'm having a hard time thinking of a specific example where they've contradicted, okay. But I do know of one example of a judge who used to work as a trial attorney and would select jurors and said that the number one thing that predicts jurors, how they're going to behave on a jury, is the type of socks that they're wearing. That you can tell a lot about a person by what their socks look like.
Wow.
And I don't know of any empirical research on sock wearing and how that predicts attitudinal dispositions, but I do know that there is research on what it is that predicts the way that jurors make decisions. And surprisingly, it has less to do with demographics and more to do with attitude and disposition. So I don't know. But there's an example of something kind of wacky.
That is very interesting. Yeah.
Attorneys think.
Yeah. So once you said that you could see that these fields were kind of siloed, it almost made sense to me in my head, just like going there of like, I feel like a lawyer or an attorney may have a specific agenda because they have this goal to like make this claim. And then maybe the research doesn't show that on the psychological side, but you still have that agenda. And I'm curious more about your experience starting to work at that law firm of like, what was it like to be somebody who wanted to meet in the middle? Like, what was what were the interactions maybe like with coworkers, or just like you being able to share your thoughts on different topics? Like, what was that like?
It was really interesting. And the people who I worked with were very excited about my background and looking for ways that it could be useful. The type of work that you do as a summer associate is pretty limited. Oftentimes you're working on writing memos and working on briefs and things like that, because you're a lowly intern at that point. You're not given too much responsibility. But I did have a lot of fun when I was allowed to sit in on a deposition and was able to help the acting attorney on the case craft the questions that they were going to ask in this deposition to try to elicit information from the person who was being deposed. And so that was, I think, one point where I did get to tap into my psychology background to get more of that information.
Mm-hmm. This is more of like a macro question now, but I guess what was your experience of seeing like what's missing in terms of the intersection between psychology and law? Like, where are we kind of at going wrong with that?
So I don't want to put the blame entirely on one side or the other, because I think that it's shared. But I will say that the legal system is incredibly slow to update its priors, to incorporate new research and new information. And we see that in a number of different places. So, for example, there's been tons and tons of eyewitness memory research, just tons of it. And the law is very slowly adopting some of the recommendations that are coming out of that eyewitness research, like recommendations that you do sequential lineups instead of showing the photos all at once. When someone's picking someone out of a lineup, you don't show them all of the photos. You give them one photo at a time, and you ask them to say yay or nay on that one photo before you move on to the next one. And the reason why that's so important is because people have a tendency to make comparisons in their mind. So they look at a photo and they're like, well, of these photos that I'm seeing, which one of them fits the best? Which one of them is closest to the memory of the individual that I have, rather than which one is spot on the person? And so if you have the photos in all of them in front of you, then people will make relative comparisons and they'll pick the best of the options. But if you show them the photos one at a time and you force them to say yes or no, then they are better at making the true decision. And so that was a recommendation that I can't remember if it was Elizabeth Loftus or Gary Wells or another person who does a lot of eyewitness memory research, but would make that recommendation. And then it took a long time for police departments and for the courts and so forth to adopt that as the typical procedure.
Yeah. So like the real implementation of the science does take a long time to put into action. And I guess even just the conversation too, probably, of like wanting to implement it as well.
Yeah. And this isn't a very popular example, but I'll throw it out there nonetheless. So there's, I think, an intuition that people who commit sex crimes are very likely to recidivate, to reoffend if you let them free. And so that is used as a justification for having longer sentences or for having civil commitment once they've served their sentence, that you still institutionalize them and keep them out of society because we're so worried about the high likelihood that they reoffend. But actually, the psychology research shows that they are one of the groups that are the least likely to reoffend. They have one of the lowest recidivism rates.
That even makes sense, because if you were to say as a statement to like support the opposition of what you just said, if you said every single sexual offender is a serial sexual offender. I wouldn't believe that. Right. Like, so I think it's an interesting point that you brought up, because I definitely, if somebody just asked me if we should be releasing people just off of my opinion, I would be like, that doesn't sound like a good idea. But I mean, it's so, what the way you phrase that is so, it's a very interesting way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no group out there that's like, we're here to support child predator rights. We think that they should be released from prison. Nobody is going to, form that organization. But there are laws that are in place that keep those individuals in prison longer or make it easier to institutionalize them, that are based on non-existent research or on research that actually says the opposite. So that's just another example of a place where the psychology research says something very different than what's actually being imposed by the legal system.
So is it fair to say then that a majority of the offenses are by first-time offenders? I mean, would that be saying the same thing? Most of the sexual crimes being committed are by first-time offenders?
I don't know if I would say that. I would instead say that first-time offenders are unlikely to reoffend compared to other types of crimes. So people who burglarize, people who commit other types of crimes are more likely to reoffend than someone who has committed a sex crime.
Got it. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, since our attitudes are held so strongly against that population of that crime, it's like it's just going to keep perpetuating until the research is implemented and discussed. And then maybe then it might not even get accepted still.
No, we might say like, well, who cares what the research said? These people are gross.
Yeah. So I'm jumping into a topic that Brennan and I don't know too much about at all, but that you brought up earlier is I'm curious about the recent work you have done with the resources and death penalty and the research that you've done in that topic. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there has been a fair amount of research on attitudes towards the death penalty. So what predicts people being in support of or against the death penalty. But the research has really focused on individual differences. So things like how religious a person is or how politically conservative a person is influences their attitudes towards capital punishment, but very focused on, as I said, individual differences. And so what my colleagues and I, and this is work that I did largely in conjunction with Ashley Votruba, who is another JD PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and who would be an awesome person for y'all to interview if you're looking for more recommendations.
Noted.
That she and I did this work together, where we were interested in if there's anything about features of the environment that might influence people's attitudes towards the death penalty in ways that maybe they're not even consciously aware of. And so we focused on resource scarcity, so the perception of how available resources are in the environment, because we had this hypothesis that historically speaking, when resources were more scarce, then it becomes more dangerous to keep an offender in the group because you're running the risk that they might possibly reoffend, right? So you have choices when somebody in the group does something really terrible. You can try to rehabilitate them and keep them in the group, or you can exclude them from the group. You could banish them, whatever, get them out of the group. And what our argument is that when resources are scarce, we don't want to spend those scarce resources on rehabilitating people who could potentially reoffend again, that it would be in our best interest, or it would be the less costly decision to get rid of them, even if it was possible, hypothetically, for them to be rehabilitated. So we first looked just globally and within the United States about whether countries that have more resources, or within the United States, whether states that have more resources are more likely to have the death penalty or not. And we found that those places that have fewer resources are the places that are more likely to have the death penalty, where it's even an option for punishment. So that's true both around the world and within the United States. Then we started to look at the question experimentally. So we wanted to experimentally manipulate people's perceptions of resource availability, get some people thinking about resources being scarce and some people thinking about resources being abundant, and then measure their attitudes towards capital punishment. And what we found is that for the group that you get thinking about resources being scarce, that they report being more willing to endorse capital punishment. And not only are they more favorable towards capital punishment, but they want it to happen faster. That they say that the time between executing someone from when they have gotten the guilty verdict and the death sentence should be shorter than it is.
Wow.
So not only get rid of them, but do it quickly.
Just do it now.
Yes. Yeah. So we found that really fascinating. And so we looked into what might be the mechanism between people thinking about resources being scarce and wanting to endorse the death penalty. And we found that it's this concern about repeated offending that we thought about in the beginning, that when resources are scarce, it makes you less willing to risk the possibility that someone might reoffend again. And so you get rid of that possibility by sentencing them to death.
Wow. What were some, just out of curiosity, for the, like when you were doing the specific states in the United States and looking at resources, was it just like the financial status of those states that determine their resources? And then, because I'm thinking too, like even just in you saying that, like all the states that tend to have devastation from hurricanes that would be a draw on resources that would make us, and I think there's probably some correlation there. I think there's probably, a lot of resources have to go towards constant rehabilitation of like the state, so that it would be less likely, to your point, to like want to have to also allocate a bunch of valuable resources to, because those are often a lot of the states that do have death penalty. Is that right? Those like because Florida does, and do other southern states along the Hurricane Alley, I guess, also have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera. Yeah. So we used income per capita as one of our predictor variables. And we also used life expectancy. So places that had lower life expectancy, which is associated with fewer resources, were more likely to have the death penalty. And I'll say that in that model, we controlled for political affiliation of the state. So there is this confound that southern states tend to be more conservative, but we accounted for that in our model, and we still found an effect above and beyond how conservative the states were, this resource effect.
That's really interesting to think about. I mean, so did this kind of come out of like this initial thought? I thought of something evolutionarily of like, there's a tribe, and if somebody is ill or sick and you don't have the resources, then you're going to say, yeah, I'm going to get rid of you. Like we can't go on. Right. And so I'm curious about how maybe your background in like the stereotyping and different types of ecological perspectives also informed this. Was that kind of something that went into it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were drawing on an evolutionary perspective, but if I'm being completely honest, one of the ideas for this that generated this study came from a children's book, which just goes to show you that you can get research ideas in the strangest of places. But there's this book called Elephant Adventure by Willard Price, and it's about these two brothers who they were written in the 50s, I should say. So this doesn't really happen anymore, but they were sent around to different places in the world to collect animals for zoos. So zoos would pay them and say, hey, we need an elephant. Go get us an elephant. These are fiction. This is all fiction. Anyway, so they're in Africa trying to find elephants for zoos, and they are working with an indigenous group there. And the brothers were asking, oh, when someone does something wrong, do you put them into a jail? And the member of the tribe said, jail? What are you talking about? Jail? No, we give them a cup of poison to drink because we don't have the resources for a jail. We don't, everyone has to pull their weight in the group. We can't afford to keep around people who aren't contributing to the group. So no, we don't even have the concept of jail. And again, this is all fiction. So I wouldn't make the claim that that's actually true, but this idea of, you have to have a lot of resources to be investing them in rehabilitation or even just incapacitation in general. Of keeping people in prison, it takes a lot of resources. If you don't have them, then getting rid of the person might be the more efficient and thing to do that is better in terms of the long run for the group.
Man, I just see this spanning across like everything. Like, I think this is such a good thing to look at to understand how impactful this is, and then also see it like in my work or looking at like county funding for like mental health. The resources, while they're there, they're not where they should be. Like they are pretty scarce, and people working within mental health fields serving like lower SES populations are stressed, and they're overworked, and they have too many hours, and they have too many clients. And it's like, since their resources are scarce, they might not be able to devote a lot of time to specific clients. And so certain problems about a client's presenting concerns might get dismissed, and they might get neglected, when if you could devote a lot of your time to like 2 or 3 clients over the course of the whole week, you can really support that whole person. And that's what happens in some private practice places where people can really charge larger fees. And it's a huge disparity.
Yeah. When resources are scarce, you cut your losses. Mm-hmm. And you have to find ways to invest those scarce resources in the most productive ways.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Man, this is very interesting. And so I think this could be a good segue into thinking about like the ecological factors and how that influences stereotypes and prejudice, and the work that you've done with that. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about that, because Brennan and I were really getting deep into that before this conversation. So we're excited about this topic.
I got a few questions.
Okay, I'll do my best to answer them for you. So let me start off by saying that this is work that I've done in collaboration with my prior lab mate, Oliver Sung, and Steve Newberg as well. So these projects are ones that the three of us have been working on together for a long time. And what brought about this idea is that there has been a lot of research about the content of race stereotypes. So since the 1930s, there has been research that tries to find out, what are white Americans' stereotypes of Black Americans. And those stereotypes have remained surprisingly consistent through the decades. But what my collaborators and I were interested in investigating is not what's the content of those stereotypes, but why is the content what it is? What explains why we have the stereotypes that we do? And one potentially surprising, maybe to you, answer to that is that these stereotypes might not be about race at all, that they might instead be about this underlying variable of ecology. And so when I say ecology, what I'm referring to is the home environment that someone is from and that lives in, and specifically the harshness and the unpredictability of that environment. So do you live in an environment that has a lot of resources or few resources? Do you live in an environment where things are very predictable and you know what's going to happen day to day? Or do you live in an environment that is very unpredictable where you don't know what's going to happen day to day? And so what we were interested in our first step, taking away the race stuff for a second and setting that aside, what we were interested in to begin with was this question of, do we stereotype other people based on the environment in which they live, or their presumed home environment? And there's a lot of research out there that talks about how environment shapes the behavior of organisms. And I say organisms because I want to make clear that it's not limited to human beings. It's across the animal kingdom of how environment shapes behavior. And so this research shows that in environments that are harsh and unpredictable, you get a more present-focused orientation as compared to a future-focused orientation in environments that are resource sufficient and predictable. And these present-focused orientations include things like more impulsivity, more sexual unrestrictedness, more social opportunism, so opportunistic behavior, less investment for humans, now talking less investment in education, and less investment in offspring. And then you see sort of the opposite trends in environments that are resource sufficient and predictable. So we know that environments actually do shape the behaviors of the people and the animals who live within those environments. And what we were interested in was whether people have stereotypes that track what we know about how environment shapes behavior. And it would absolutely make sense if environment does shape behavior in these ways, that social perception would be attuned to that, and that we would form stereotypes. We would have these beliefs about how the environment shapes behavior. So our very first step in all of this was just to see if that was the case, that we do have stereotypes about people based on the environments in which they live. So we ran a study where we asked people to imagine an individual who lives in either a harsh and unpredictable environment, which we sometimes refer to as a desperate ecology, or to imagine a person who lives in a resource-rich and predictable, which we sometimes refer to as a hopeful ecology. And then we asked, how impulsive is this individual? How sexually unrestricted is this individual likely to be? How invested in their education, invested in their children? How socially opportunistic? And when I say socially opportunistic, I mean things like being physically aggressive or engaging in criminal behavior, that kind of thing. And what we found was that, yes, people did have stereotypes of others based on the information that we gave about the ecology. So people in desperate ecologies were stereotyped as being more impulsive, more sexually unrestricted, more opportunistic, and less invested in their education and their children than people from hopeful ecologies. So that was step one. I want to pause here and ask if I should keep going, or if you want to ask questions about that.
Keep going.
Yeah. All right. So our next step was to check into some alternative explanations for those findings. So one thing that you might ask or think to yourself is, well, is this really just about money? Are these just wealth stereotypes alone, that people are just paying attention to whether an environment is rich or poor, and that's all? And what we would say is that resources are important. They say something about the carrying capacity of the ecology, and resources are a component, right? Whether it's resource rich or resource poor is a component, but it's not only about resources, because there's this important piece of unpredictability. And so, for example, if you had a place that had a lot of resources, but was really, really unpredictable, then you would actually expect to see more of these, what we call fast life history strategy behaviors, the present focused behaviors of being more impulsive, right? Because so what that you have a lot of resources, you could lose them the next day. And so you have to be willing to take risks. So it's not just about wealth. And we looked into that by changing our vignettes that we were giving people to say, not just imagine a person from a desperate or hopeful environment, but also that this person made either $15,000 or $150,000 last year. So we were giving information about personal wealth of the individual too. And we found that even within levels of personal wealth, the ecology information mattered. So even the people who were both making $150,000, that those who were in the desperate ecology were stereotyped as being more sexually unrestricted, more impulsive, et cetera, et cetera. So these are not derived from wealth stereotypes. Ecology stereotypes are not simply about wealth. And then we also did a study where we were looking to see if people were just associating positive traits with hopeful ecologies, so that regardless of what the trait was, that if it was positive, they would say it's more likely in a hopeful ecology. And our argument was that it's only these characteristics that are tied to life history strategy. So we included some things like enjoys being with friends. How likely is it that this person enjoys being with friends? Or how likely is it that this person is materialistic or hardworking, or things that were both positively and negatively valenced, but that we wouldn't expect ecology information to push around. And we found, as we expected, that the ecology information didn't change people's beliefs about how likely someone is to enjoy time with friends or to be materialistic or hardworking. It's really only these traits of sexually unrestricted and impulsive and so forth that are tied to life history strategy that were being pushed around by the ecology information. So then this is now where the race piece comes in. Should I pause again or keep going?
Yeah, I did actually have one question.
Yes.
And I think because you brought up the money piece, which was something that I was thinking about. And I was thinking about it in the context of like, is that an underlying solution to everything kind of, or like does that shift ecology in a meaningful enough way to create a difference to reform the ecology? But I think before we even get into that, maybe if you could help me understand what some of the components of ecology are, because like, I think obviously you mentioned the financial piece is part of it. I would imagine maybe like safety being a component of your ecology. What other important components of ecology are like relevant to be thinking about in this conversation?
Yeah, so that's spot on, that we're talking about these two dimensions of harshness and unpredictability. So anything that makes your environment more or less predictable or more or less harsh, so that affects the extrinsic mortality of the environment. So as you say, safety could be one of them, that places where, for example, there's a lot of random violence happening, that we would see that as being more of a desperate ecology than a hopeful ecology. And we would expect that in places that have a lot of random violence, that it would promote these fast life history strategy behaviors, the present focused orientation.
Okay, cool. So I'll let you keep going then from where you were, and then I'll have a question again at the end.
Sure. Well, so also to answer your question about is wealth the answer to everything, I think no. Actually, what's really interesting about this research is that it suggests that money alone is not necessarily the best intervention. Mm-hmm. That if you pour a lot of money into an ecology, but you're not doing anything to change the unpredictability aspect of it, then you are not being as effective as you could be. And so many of the interventions that we think about when we think about improving the environments that people live in, we think immediately about money and not so much about predictability. But things like, and this is just one example, like after school programs, right, can bring a lot of predictability to kids' lives, right, where you're giving them a safe place to spend time after school, or things that have to do with stabilizing employment in an area, because unemployment is one of the greatest sources of unpredictability in people's lives. So what can you do to make more employment opportunities, right? That's not directly just throwing money at the problem. It's being a bit more targeted. And so I think there's great opportunities for thinking about interventions for improving people's lives and improving people's environments that don't necessarily rely entirely on wealth. Yeah.
Yeah. I think too that and kind of what I'm picking up from what you're saying is like, it's the targeted application of resources, not resources to not mean just financial resources. Like school opportunities and regularity and schedule, things of that nature that as a whole will help reform a place's ecology, not just, because it would come without all the prerequisite things that wouldn't be needed in order to then take advantage of increased wealth and financials in a particular area. So money alone just, it realistically couldn't solve the problem by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what an interesting, terrible time that we've had over the past 2 years, looking at how this is playing out too, with just an ongoing unpredictability. Of course, there are it's good that some things are getting brought to light about current societal situations. And at the same time, you can definitely see people's emotions are rising high right now due to a lot of different types of stressors that are impacting them.
And not only that, but the unpredictability isn't equally distributed across groups or across environments.
Right.
Would you say that we've seen a collective decreasing in overall societal predictability of our environment? Have we all shifted our ecologies towards the unpredictable in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a reasonable idea, that it's quite plausible that COVID has become an enormous source of unpredictability for people's lives. And maybe all of us have shifted our life history strategies towards the more present focused side as a result.
Yeah.
Right. So,
you were in the middle of heading into the race part of the research. So please continue from where you were.
Sure. So getting back now to this question of race. So it turns out that in America, race and ecology are somewhat confounded, in that Black Americans are relatively more likely to live in desperate ecologies than white Americans, and white Americans are relatively more likely to live in more hopeful ecologies. And it's not a perfect correlation by any means, but it is the confound that exists. And so what my collaborators and I wondered is if maybe people are using race as a cue to ecology, that it is essentially you see someone of a particular race and that gives you information about their presumed home ecology. And so you apply the ecology stereotypes to the individual on the basis of their race, right? So stereotyping Black Americans as being more likely to be impulsive and sexually unrestricted and less invested in their education and in their offspring, and more likely to be physically aggressive and criminal than white Americans, because you think that it's more likely that Black Americans are coming from a more desperate ecology. And so we ran a study where we asked people to imagine a Black person and imagine a white person, and then fill out the trait questionnaire of how likely is this person to be sexually unrestricted, impulsive, et cetera, et cetera. And then the same thing, but just imagine a person from a desperate ecology and imagine a person from a hopeful ecology. And it turns out that the patterns of those two results map on nearly perfectly to one another, that people make the same inferences about Black Americans that they do about people from desperate ecologies. So this is some initial evidence that maybe people are using race kind of as a proxy for ecology. But then that suggests that if you provide more direct information about ecology, then people would use the ecology information instead of the race information in their stereotypes. So basically, if you have the better cue, the thing that actually causally predicts behavior, why would you use the secondary heuristic proxy cue? You wouldn't anymore. You would use the thing that is a better, more straightforward predictor. And so what we're arguing is that better, more straightforward predictor is ecology. So we modified our vignettes to ask people to imagine a Black individual from a hopeful ecology or from a desperate ecology, and imagine a white individual from a hopeful ecology or from a desperate ecology, and then measured their stereotypes of these different people. And it turns out that we were able to wipe out the race effects entirely. So Black Americans and white Americans in desperate ecologies were stereotyped as being equally sexually unrestricted and impulsive and opportunistic and so on and so forth. And Black Americans and white Americans from hopeful ecologies were stereotyped as being equally unlikely to be sexually unrestricted and impulsive and so on and so forth. So you no longer see the race differences once you have the ecology information presented, which we thought was really, really cool.
Yeah, that's such a deep insight to be able to gather from the research. And it's cool to hear you break down how you constructed each phase of like gathering the deeper understanding. Because I mean, when you say that, I'm just like, yeah, you're right. That's so true, right? I think that's exactly, even when I, see things in, daily life that I think kind of fall in line with what we're talking about. I think it's very clear that it is ecologically driven. When you think about what factors would that person or what data points would that person be using to be making a judgment like that, there probably are just actually talking about their ecology.
Yeah.
Right.
Have either of you, do you watch SNL by any chance?
A fair amount, not a ton lately,
somewhat.
but yeah, a little bit.
Are you familiar with the Black Jeopardy skit?
Yeah. The one with Tom Hanks is,
That's ecology. That
Yes.
is the whole underlying joke of the Black Jeopardy sketch that has Tom Hanks in it, is that there's a shared ecology. And that is what explains why Tom Hanks is responding correctly to the answers that the host is giving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
That is
so
totally
That's a really
in line
good,
with our research.
Yeah, that's a really good pop culture example that is easy to comprehend too.
He references the guy around the corner who fixes everything, and so he doesn't fix it at the shop. And they're like, yeah, wow, that illuminates everything. So what were your initial reactions, or maybe even now, like thinking about the findings that you were presented with based on this research? What were some of your thoughts?
Well, so one thing that I think is super cool about this research is there's a lot more work to be done that we're in the middle of doing. So, for example, one question that you might have is, do these ecology stereotypes exist outside of the United States? Like, all of your research up to this point has been with people within the US. So do we see the same ecology stereotypes in other places? And our prediction would be, yes, absolutely, because ecology predicts the kind of behaviors that people engage in, no matter what country you're talking about. And so we have asked the same questions about getting people's stereotypes of individuals from hopeful and desperate ecologies in the UK, in Romania, in Japan, and in India. And the results all look the same, that people have the same ecology stereotypes, no matter where it is that you're asking. Another question that you might have is, well, in your research, you focused on white American stereotypes about white and Black Americans, but do Black Americans have the same stereotypes? And so we did a nationally representative survey where we gathered information from not only white participants, but also Asian participants and Black participants, and found that our results all replicated, that they all have the same ecology stereotypes and the same race by ecology stereotypes, where if you have the ecology information, the race stereotypes go away. So that was really cool. And then some work that we are doing right now is also trying to tease apart these ideas of harshness and unpredictability. So in our studies up to this point, we have combined them. So we've asked people to imagine environments that are both harsh and unpredictable. But as I have sort of been alluding to throughout, these are two different things. And so people might have different stereotypes about environments that are really unpredictable, but resource rich. And so we are starting to tease those two apart. And we are finding that, yes, people's stereotypes are attuned to both pieces of information, that they're not redundant with one another, that we have stereotypes that are sensitive to both the harshness of the ecology and the unpredictability of the ecology. So that has been really fun work as well. And then I can pause here for.
Well, I had a question. I was just going to ask if you have any ideas potentially as to what may be like the evolutionary understanding of where this like is coming from? Because it seems to be quite a human phenomenon, right? Of like this, perspective on people's ecology and how we perceive them. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I was gonna ask like same thing about like what is the function of this stereotype?
Yeah.
Well, so the function is to be able to make somewhat accurate predictions about the behaviors of others, that it is really useful for us to be able to predict how other people are going to behave. And so we need to pick up on what are the kinds of features that are associated with or that predict their behavior. And so ecology across time has been one of those features that enables us to make pretty good predictions about how someone is likely to behave. So we've developed the tendency to rely on ecology information for our stereotypes.
So I'm just trying to think like, okay, so let's go back to like the hunter-gatherer idea that Nick was presenting earlier in the last example we were talking about. I feel like a long time ago, this would have been a very difficult, right? Like race would probably not have been an identifiable trait to somebody's ecology in any way, right? As it maybe.
Well, we wouldn't have even interacted with people of other races for the most part.
So what would have been the identifiers in like a long time ago that would have alluded to somebody's ecology? Do we know like what those could have been?
So it's a fantastic question that you're asking. And actually, one of the research areas that we're also going into is thinking about what are the visible cues to ecology. Like in all of our vignettes, we told people what ecology someone was from before asking about their stereotypes. But you don't walk up to someone on the street and say, "Hi, I'm from a desperate ecology, and so stereotype me." That you have to make those inferences from perceivable cues. So we're in the process of trying to figure out what other than race is a perceivable cue to ecology. And there are things like dental health and posture and accent and the kind of clothing one wears that are possibilities that we're investigating.
Yeah, because we've had a few conversations now about like the disgust mechanisms and what we see as far as like a way of regulating our personal health, right? Like if we see something that disgusts us, then we use that as a like, okay, I should stay away from that because it could pose a risk to me. And I'm curious if there's like, I don't know, odor. I don't know if that's something that would be relevant, right? Like, so, okay. So that's interesting. So there's definitely more to come on that. I'll be watching closely to see what comes out of that. But yeah, because I think it's interesting because obviously this was a selected for, like we continue to do this because it served us, right? In some capacity. So how did it start serving us, and is it still serving us the same way, or has it kind of been reformed by like the modern day, I guess, is kind of where I'm trying to think about this. So
the mind is very, very good about picking up associations between variables. So even if those exact variables didn't exist throughout evolutionary history, our evolved mind is able to pick up on new associations and use those.
Yeah.
That's something I enjoyed about the paper, was that it really highlighted that while something may have been adaptive, it doesn't mean that it was like morally correct. And it doesn't mean that we still have to like go by that and accept it. Because I think it could be easy to fall into that, like, well, it's serving us, so we need to keep doing it. And yeah, we can see that that's not the right way to go about things, and it's kind of dangerous.
Yeah. And another point that we make in the paper is that stereotypes are not the only predictors of prejudice. So knowing more about where the stereotypes come from doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to reduce the prejudices that people have or the discrimination that people employ. But it's a step. I think that the more we know about why things are the way that they are, the more tools that we have to design effective interventions.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think it's interesting that you noted, like when we were asked about like kind of the function of stereotypes, that people want to make things predictable. And it's exactly what the findings are showing, of that, like these unpredictable situations people are not doing well in. And so like our brain is constantly looking for this predictability. And man, it's the same exact thing in like work clinically with like caregivers and child. Like they might have a lack of resources and a different socioeconomic status, which of course adds stressors to many different levels of parenting. But at the same time, if there's like a predictable level of response to the child, like that child can still really flourish. But once things get unpredictable and inconsistent, that's when there can be some serious problems. And yeah, I think I've really enjoyed this conversation and these topics, because it's just, you're really showing the evidence, and it's like spanning across everything that I've started to experience in my young adulthood.
Well, I had another question too, about as far as what you guys have been able to observe, how do you feel like an ecology is best reformed, maybe to like better suit the population that lives in it? Because I feel like that's, got to be a goal of society, right? Is to improve everybody's ecology and like make sure that everybody's living in the most like stable, livable environment that they can. So did you guys see any trends in like, or have you seen anything just like anecdotally that, hey, when this happens, the whole like quality of the ecology tends to go up?
Well, so many of these questions are above my pay grade, that they're they're beyond the type of work that I do. But I can absolutely see connections from the research that we have on how you might then think about applying it out in the real world. One thing that I did want to make really explicit is that there's nothing inherently wrong about desperate ecologies and about fast life history strategies, that they're adaptive responses to the kind of environment that you're in. And so as human beings, we tend to moralize, like we say, oh, teenage pregnancy is bad. This is a societal ill that we need to correct. But too often we focus on it as in the sense of, well, if teens just had more information, if we just had more sex education, then we would solve this problem, because teens are making stupid decisions. And so we just need to educate them to fix it. But actually, if you're in a desperate ecology and an environment that is harsh and unpredictable, speeding up your reproductive timeline is actually extraordinarily functional. It is a smart decision to do that, because if you don't, then you run the risk of dying before you have the chance to reproduce. So I think as I said, we have a tendency to moralize things, but if we thought about it from an evolutionary perspective on what is the functional response given the inputs that people are getting, then we can kind of take the moral out of it a little bit. The example that I like to use, which is a silly one, but sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs, but we don't moralize that. We don't say like, oh, look at this promiscuous turtle with all of its eggs. It couldn't possibly parent each of them effectively. Well, of course not. But that's the point, is that the turtle has so many eggs because only a few of them are expected to survive. And so the more you have, the more likely it is that at least some of them will live on to reproduce themselves. So again, we can see it really easily when we're talking about turtles, but as soon as we talk about human beings, then sometimes it's harder for people to realize that the behavior is, equally functional, and maybe should not be so moralized.
Kind of brings up a lot of, because I'm thinking about like, because I'm checking myself on my question and seeing if like, okay, if I was making that assumption, right, that there must be something that needs to be changed about their ecology, which is kind of how I phrased my question. But then on the other hand too, I definitely get the sense that like societally, that's like an unspoken goal society wide. So would you say that this is more of like a retooling of the way that we're like just perceiving society as a whole? Or I don't know, like, because it kind of rattles my like thought of like, okay, like, but we have such like a community of people who are like trying to like, hey, let's like improve the quality of life for everybody, and like that's a good thing. But like, and maybe it's just a matter of like, hey, let's do it, but let's not shame it. Maybe that's kind of where I'm trying to reckon with both sides of this. But yeah, where do you stand on that whole like tug and pull of both sides of this topic? Because I think, you do bring up a really good point that just because like evolutionarily, like they are, people in those types of ecologies are very responsive to the demands put on them by that ecology. And that's a normal thing. And that shouldn't be a point of shame. But at the same time, I think a lot of people also will make the argument that like, okay, well, just to use your example that you were giving already is like, but then are those children who are born in younger pregnancies being supported and set up to be their best self as they grow and develop as well? And if the answer is no, which I think that's a lot of the messaging, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But do we need to still prioritize this as like a major topic, or are we, and again, we're probably getting into like so much of the weeds that like this conversation probably isn't going to solve massive world problems, but what is your opinion?
So I think you hit the nail absolutely on the head when you said, like, consider the problem, but don't shame that, and don't view it as people are making stupid decisions. Mm-hmm. And instead that people are making functional decisions given the circumstances that they're under. But maybe we want to change those circumstances so that we can change the outcomes, if we agree as a society that that is important to do.
Yeah, I like the metaphor you all used in the paper talking about like fats and sweets and how we've evolved to, really select for those. And then we shame people who now eat those and preference those. And it's like, well, let's think about like where this came from and how this evolved. Because, yeah, we don't take the time to really think about that or have that conversation. It's, what are we seeing? Okay, that's the problem. Okay, you're the problem. You need to fix that. But I think I do want to make time for talking about friendship quality. And for people who heard our conversation with Dr. Jamie Krems, we talked about friendship quality and jealousy. And I know you're a colleague and friend. So I also wanted to get your perspective about the recent study that you both have been collaborating on.
Absolutely. Yes. So Dr. Krems has been doing this really awesome work on friendship jealousy that I've been fortunate to collaborate with her on. And so I'm always on the lookout for interlopers who are trying to come and snatch Jamie away. Unacceptable. But we have also been doing some work together on the qualities that people look for in friends and the types of characteristics that we seek in our friends. And this is stuff that is, I can't even say hot off the presses because it's not even in press yet. It was just received a minor revision at Evolution and Human Behavior. So hopefully will be available not too long in the future. Fingers crossed. But that work is looking, as I said, at the kind of qualities that we seek in our friends, and specifically on if there might be some sex differences in what type of characteristics we want in our friends. So do men and women have different preferences for their friends? And there's some reason to believe that they might, because evolutionarily speaking, female and male friendships, same-sex friendships, have served somewhat different functions. So Dr. Krems probably talked about this, so I won't go into too much detail about it. But for those who haven't heard her podcast, that male friendships, right, evolutionarily speaking, were bands, coalitions that would work together to raid other groups and to protect their own group, whereas female friendships were more to help with alloparenting, which is this idea that of non-related kin sort of banding together to help parent offspring together. And females compared to males were also more likely to leave their natal groups. And so they would not be around their own families anymore. And that means that they would have to find other friends who could kind of take the place of those family members. And so for females, friendships kind of functioned as a replacement for kin. And that's not the case for males. So anyway, given that we have these historically somewhat different functions for female and male same-sex friendships, maybe we still seek qualities that are promoted by those particular different functions. So for example, maybe men still seek friends who are more physically formidable and could have their back in a fight, right? Whereas for women, maybe they are seeking someone who is to be emotionally intimate with and to serve that kind of same function of kin, of someone that you can share your secrets with, and so forth. And so that's what we found in our study when we were asking men and women about different qualities that they prefer in their friendships, that relative to women, men preferred friends who would help them to gain status and gain resources, would have their backs in a fight, and who could help them to acquire new potential mates. Whereas women, relative to men, preferred friends who would provide sort of emotional intimacy and would also share social information with them.
What did the methodology kind of look like?
So we asked people if a series of questions that were always phrased in, agree or disagree with statements like, it is important to me that my friends, and then one item would be, have my back in a physical fight, or it is important to me that my friends share gossip with me, so on and so forth. And then, so that was in study one, where we were just asking people to report kind of their ideal friendship preferences. And then in the second study, we were interested in if people's actual best friends have these characteristics. So we changed the study to ask them, to what extent is it true that your best friend will have your back in a physical fight? And then to what extent is it true that your friend shares gossip with you? So then in our final study, we borrowed a paradigm from behavioral economics called the budget methodology, where we gave people a limited amount of friendship dollars that they could spend towards different traits. And we looked to see when someone has a really big friendship dollar budget so they can spend on lots of different things, what does it look like? How do they spend their money on these different traits? And then when they have a really small friendship budget, what do they spend their money on? So that enables us to look at what are the necessities that people will spend limited amounts of money on versus what are the luxuries where if you have the money, you'll spend it on that trait, but if you don't, you'll skip it.
This is so interesting. For some reason, like immediately my mind goes to like how we really love watching sports and love watching like aggressiveness and physicality and this like band of people coming together to really support one another and then defeat somebody else. Like we love that. Like people eat that up, and it just like makes so much sense to me as to like potentially why we like seeing that.
And by we, it's men more than women.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
it's so tribal, right?
Yeah.
We form our friends around these teams that we like to follow. We even call the teams our team.
Yeah.
And like we even have language around it that is so like deeply personal because, those are the types of people we want to be around and we want to associate with as like creating our friend group, as real or not real as it is. Like those people on that team are our teammates. Yeah. It's so funny the way that interplay plays out in like things like sports.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes me curious about like cross-gender relationships too, and cross-gender friendships, what the utility is looking like and what different qualities people look for in that. I know that maybe wasn't the focus of this study, but I'm curious about your thoughts.
So David Lewis actually has some research on opposite sex friendships and what people seek in opposite sex friends. And if I'm recalling his research correctly, some of the findings were that men are looking for female friends who might potentially end up as mates, but women are not really doing the same thing. They're not seeing their opposite sex male friends as potential romantic partners.
Wow. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. That is super interesting. I'm curious about what your reactions and thoughts were about like this research too, once you like saw these findings.
So I think that they fit in with a growing body of research on friendship. So there's another researcher, Adar Eisenbrook, who has been doing some work on, he has a great paper called Social Taste Buds that suggests that the kind of characteristics that we seek in friends are the same characteristics that would have been useful across evolutionary history. And so I see the work that Jamie and I are doing on friendship preferences as really fitting in quite nicely with this growing body of literature. And friendship, maybe Dr. Crumbs mentioned this in the podcast, is a really understudied area of relationships. If you search for romantic relationships in psychology, I mean, you're just getting thousands and thousands and thousands of results. People have studied romantic relationships forever and have studied it to death. But friendships, not so much. Even though these are such important social relationships in our lives, the amount of friendship literature compared to the amount of literature on romantic relationships is just this tiny, tiny slice. So I would encourage people who are listening to this podcast to consider friendship as an area to explore for research, because there's so much more that still needs to be done.
Yeah.
One thing in particular that Jamie and I are interested in doing is looking to see if these sex differences in friendship preferences are the same across cultures. And so you might predict that if they're derived from these different functions of friendship that have been the same across the species, then we would expect to see similarity in friendship preferences across cultures. So we're excited to explore that next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we were talking about predictability and unpredictability, I thought about like how important social support and friendship is in that process. Like if you know, I mean, extended family, but if you have that additional support of friendship that you know you can rely on and that you know you can go to, and you have predictable outcomes with them, then man, it's just going to like really boost your sense of self-security and self-esteem.
Yeah, so, absolutely. Social network is another source of predictability or unpredictability in people's lives.
Yeah.
Crazy. I'm curious too now, like what types, and you know, this may be another field for some future listener who's going to get into friendship research to get into, but what leads to the like dissolution of a friendship, and what are like the factors that play into like friendships falling apart? And is there, go so many directions with that, but I'm just curious, like, because these friendships, they're very purpose driven. So is it like the betrayal of the purpose in which the friendships are formed that leads to the destruction of a friendship, or what leads to two people thinking that like it's time to go separate ways? That's interesting thought too.
Super interesting. And I think an area that's really ripe for research. I know that Jessica Ayers, who's a graduate student at Arizona State right now, is interested in friendship dissolution. I'm not familiar with the findings that she's come up with yet, but it's just such an interesting question. Yeah. And I think you're making a really excellent point of, you know, if there are these different functions of friendship, then is it when that function no longer serves its purpose that we see friendships dissolve?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has been awesome. Just in conclusion, I'm curious about kind of if you were to give some advice to somebody who's maybe potentially wanting to embark on a road in graduate school, could be any topic, but a PhD program, maybe it's joint JD PhD. What would be something that you'd like to hit home for them?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'd say read a ton. That graduate school is one of the best times that you have to familiarize yourself with a really vast literature, and reading a lot is one of the best ways to get research ideas. So I would recommend that. I would say let your interests dictate your research. That this is advice that I'm giving personally that I don't know that a lot of people would share. So take it with a grain of salt. But I consider myself a dabbler. I have always been a dabbler. I will die a dabbler. But I just like to investigate a lot of different questions in different areas. And it's not the mode that is taught in graduate school much, that instead there tends to be a focus on like develop a program of research and focus in on that one area. And I would say to hell with that you should research what you love and what excites you.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for today, Dr. Williams. It's been great to hear about your work and your life and your insights. And to listeners, go dabble.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.